This session is with colleagues of mine from the Wicked Media, and the argument we're discussing is the nature of the campaign. We had a lot of that coming out in the discussion this morning, whether the campaign is engaging, whether it's efficacious in terms of engaging with those who will make their minds up in September the 18th, 2014. With me now, I'm delighted to welcome Iain Cochrane, who's the editor of the Telegraph in Scotland, George Kerevan, a columnist for the Scotsman, Hamish Macdonell, a freelance of much renown who writes for several newspapers, formerly of the Scotsman, and Iain Macwhirter, whose primary outlet is the Herald. So 4 journalists, 4 writers of considerable distinction before you. I'm going to try and make it more discursive rather than speeches, but nonetheless, we need something to kick us off, and so I invite Iain Cochrane to get us going. Iain, a judgment on the campaign, sort of half time, as John Curtis described it. How do you see it so far?
In terms of the campaign, the onus is very much on the separatists to make the case for fundamental change, which is what they are about. As Professor Bell this morning said, without wishing to be biased in any way, said that uncertainty is the enemy of change, and that's the problem the Yes campaign, so-called, has. And in spite of the stuff from Nicola Sturgeon and others about how things are moving in their direction, I mean, as far as I can see, the precise opposite is the case. Nothing is shifting. They're still stuck on 30% where they've been for a generation. And whereas the great Ulster comedian Frank Carson used to say, that's the way I tell him, in this country it appears to be it's the way we ask them. Because if you add the word separate to any of the questions on independence, support plummets. I mean, as John Curtis's figures show, if you ask the question about Scotland being an independent country separate from the UK, support is down to 29%. But of course, that's precisely what the SNP and the Yes campaign want, Scotland to be a separate country outside the UK. So let's be honest in the rest of this campaign, and who knows what will happen to their support.
Do you see any change coming, Alan? Do you see any change, or do you see it staying as is? Well, perhaps a better question, what could make a difference? What could change?
Well, I'm not going to suggest anything to the Yes campaign that might help them, but we've been waiting for, well, this campaign's been running effectively for 2 years now. Nothing has changed in their support. It's bottoms out at 28, 29, occasionally 30%. It's up, they are struggling, and nothing, all they can do is pretend that they have a momentum. And that's what they're going to try and pretend to the voters, that their bandwagon is rolling. It most certainly is not.
George Kerevan. George, what do you reckon?
Well, let me try and be a bit more objective than my good friend. If you ask yourself, if a third of the people in Scotland are undecided between the Union, 300 years of the Union, the monarchy, 2 world wars, all the panoply of what's probably the strongest national identity in the world, if a third of Scots can't make up their mind between that and starting a new nation, then something clearly has shifted in the politics of the United Kingdom. And it's that break that interests me. How it's resolved, we can debate. I mean, I would like it to be resolved in a yes vote. But clearly the disenchantment with the British political model and British national identity is acute in Scotland. And that fascinates me. It tells me that anything that random and emotional that happens in the next 6 months could sway the debate quite dramatically. What it seems to me is that it is actually more volatile a political situation than one reading of the statistics that John Curtis gave this morning bears out. It's very volatile because of the disenchantment with the existing model. And even if that disenchantment doesn't lead to a yes vote come September, it is still there, it's still embedded in the DNA of the political system we have, which just says to me that at some point something has to give. Final point, I'm intrigued particularly by the non-impact on the morale of the Yes campaign by the kind of stasis in the vote. Now, it's true that winning campaigns often have wobbles at the last minute. Mrs. Thatcher's campaign in 87 had a famous wobble when they had no chance of losing. But it's indicative that the whatever bravado Alan's put on it, the No campaign, the leadership No campaign, are not as, as optimistic as the polls would suggest they should be. And equally, the Yes campaign still feels there's everything to play for. And it's in that divide between the pessimism, the wobble, if you like, of going on in the No camp, and the continued very strong optimism in the Yes camp and amongst the campaigners, that divide suggests to me that the game is still on.
Hamish, what do you reckon?
I don't think it's over, but I do think it would take an awful lot for the Yes campaign to turn over what has been just a kind of unremitting story through all the polling. If there had been much more variation, I think there would be much more for the Yes campaign to hope for. But because for the last 12, 14, 16 months we haven't seen a lot of movement, and also because, and I think that this is one of the fundamental points we have to look at today, and I hate to put it in this way, but I think that the campaign has actually become quite dull. I think that a lot of people who are outside politics and outside journalism, and a lot of them were talking to me saying, oh, you'll have an exciting year this year, isn't things all really picking up? And I'm thinking to myself, well, no, they're not, actually. We're in exactly the same sort of situation as far as opinions are concerned and as far as the debate is concerned as we have been for months now. I really hope that the campaign takes off. I hope that in the next few months something happens, whether it's a major gaffe from one side, whether it's a major leap from the other, something that sets this campaign on fire, because I have a fear that we're going to trundle on for another few months and then things will really start to maybe pick up through the summer, and let's hope they do, and we'll get towards September. But I have a fear that it's not going to be quite as exciting as we had hoped. One of the problems I think that we have is that we haven't really seen, I don't think, a debate between the Yes camp and the No camp. We have seen the UK government setting out the case for No through all the analysis papers that they have produced, and we have the Scottish government, which has set out its case for Yes through the White Paper. And the two governments have got very entrenched sides, but we haven't really seen in big campaigning terms Blair Jenkins, Alistair Darling, and the Yes and No camps. And I would hope that if we are to get a much, much better campaign, that the campaign will move away from the governments and perhaps focus on the camps.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Hamish, let's bring in Iain Macwhirter, please. Iain.
Well, I'd agree with George about the somewhat surprising morale of the Yes campaigns. It's true, they are very optimistic, and they're very pleased with their campaign, and it has had a considerable resonance, except it's not making any difference on the opinion polls, as we've been hearing today. And it hasn't shown much indication yet of persuading those undecideds that they really should support independence as a way of getting devolution max. And that is going to be a real problem, I think, for the Yes campaign, because as it approaches the referendum, it's trying to argue two things. It's trying to argue for independence and for devolution max at the same time. And that's a form of devolution, of course. So it's going to get tangled up in a lot of confusion there. As far as the No campaign is concerned, I mean, it's not been very pretty, but it's been pretty effective. They established air superiority, if you like, very early on, because obviously the Scottish press, on the whole, editorially supports the Union. There's no paper in Scotland that supports independence as a matter of editorial policy, though some of them do, of course, give a wide access to supporters of the Yes campaign. But it's been very important, that, I think, because it's prevented the Yes campaign from escaping from this very narrow confine of these two issues of the currency and the membership of the EU too. I mean, I believe these to be essentially bogus issues. I think it's a disingenuous agenda, as we've been hearing today. I don't think for a minute that that Scotland would be thrown out of the EU if it became independent. I don't think for a minute that England would in some way prevent Scotland from using the pound. But these two, if you like, scare stories have really lodged in people's minds to the extent that they feed the uncertainty that David Bell was saying is the kind of crucial factor at this stage of the game. For most Scots, a vast majority of Scots, the idea of political independence is a very, very new concept indeed. It's only in the last decade that it's become a practical possibility at all. Remember, the Scottish Parliament is only 14, 15 years old, and they haven't had time to get ready for that. So it's going to be extremely difficult to persuade people in Scotland who don't, remember, believe themselves to be in any way oppressed. The Scots are not a colony of England. They don't need national liberation here. So it's not a question of freedom, which is the central issue in most independence debates. It's about these much more narrow questions of narrow economic advantage. Hence this famous £500 question, which seems to be the one that will dominate the coverage until the referendum. If the Yes campaign is going to succeed, obviously it has to counter the fear index. It has to, in some way, persuade a very large number of Scots that voting for independence will lead to devolution max. And that they will have to do their own, if you like, their own scare, their own Project Fear about what happens in the EU referendum, whether Scotland will be taken out of Europe as a result of votes south of the border, and also welfare reform, which is a very key issue and one that Scots are very concerned about, particularly with the coming of universal benefit.